Never let a good tragedy go to waste is one of those phrases that is becoming tired in our day and age. Our personalities and pundits have long used this phrase, calling it out in a sense as an attempt to diffuse the tension that might be artificially foisted on a certain situation. And we are once again looking at this a recent situation that would fit the bill for, let's just say, public manipulation. And the reason for this episode, in fact, is to not only identify the common way that it's used, which I think for most of us listening, we have become inculcated with it. We are very familiar with this rhetoric and this language. But rather, I want to add a second layer or an option B where the same mentality can be wielded or will be used to produce the rhetoric that will motivate people to immoral violence. And so, the idea here we're going to begin with, or the event that took place, and you may have heard of it. I'm sure plenty of people have talked about it. I've seen a few, but there was the death of a person who identified as non-binary who went by the name of Next Benedict in Oklahoma. And Next Benedict, the cause of death that was initially reported or initially assumed was that she was bullied because of her gender identity. But as it oftentimes happens, as the information comes out or as it is published on what actually took place, either one of or either two stories sort of politically aligned in two different directions, or the initial reporting turned out to be not only false, but nefariously so to some extent. More than just assumptions were made. And the phrase, never let a good tragedy go to waste, has been quoted and praised and condemned over and over and over again. And it typically follows in this line where you have a tragedy and there is an opportunity for politicians to make political hay, to drum up a sense of urgency, to to present a problem and then themselves as the solution. And it actually has a bit of a double meaning here. Never let a good tragedy go to waste. On the one hand, can be very nefarious, and if we were to investigate why we think it's nefarious, then we can provide for ourselves the logical and rhetorical tools, or the intellectual tools, I think is the better way of saying, the intellectual tools for deciphering, maybe even disarming the cultural bomb that is this tragedy. So let's take the classic example. You have a tragedy, something like a school shooting. They're always tragic. Everyone knows they're tragic. The people who think that people don't think they're tragic are probably dishonest, and we're moving on. But in this idea, if we were to use the traditional sense, and I'm going to separate the traditional versus the nefarious sense, if we're going to use the traditional sense of a pundit saying something like "never let a good tragedy go to waste," we might infer that the sincerity of the speaker is not, or the speaker, the person willing to say that, is more opportunistic, and they do not have a sincere concern about the issue they are about to lecture you on. In other words, it's a bit of a disingenuous framing. When somebody says, like a politician, a Hillary Clinton or a Joe Biden or whatever it is, a mayor, a governor, anyone running for office, and they are caught saying, never let a good tragedy go to waste, the implication isn't necessarily that something negative happened and that there might be some positive action or lessons that can be learned from it, such as I'm sorry, there might be some positive lessons that can be learned from it. Rather, the issue that is being presented in that phrase, never let a good tragedy go to waste, is that the speaker doesn't actually care about the context or the event that took place. Rather, they see it as an opportunity for them to make personal gain, whether it's in their campaign or in their pocketbook. So the issue here isn't, how would we differentiate that from somebody who thought or saw a tragedy and said, you know what, I actually have a solution for that. You see this oftentimes, and I'll use an example. We've seen this. There was every time there's a school shooting, you have one group of people who say something like, we need to do something about it, and the do something about it is to implement some form of slavery over the United States, punishing those who had little or nothing to do, actually had nothing to do with the wickedness that took place. And then you have another group of people who said, there's a school shooting, I have a solution, I've worked in this field, I am an expert, here's a solution in form of technology, here's a solution in form of giving, let's say, veterans jobs, or providing an opportunity for community to be involved in their own education. And even in the third one is, when there is the third one that I've kind of leaned on a little bit more lately is what we're seeing happen in these sort of public displays of violence is not only the breakdown of the family, but people's sort of abdication of their own community to, say, somebody else. They're just saying it's somebody else's problem to deal with all of the things. And some of those might be crime, and I'm not arguing in defense of vigilantism particularly. It's that there seems to be a collective a nation spanning application of that one social experiment where a woman was being like abused metaphorically. She was being abused as part of the experiment. She wasn't actually being abused in public, and every bystander, the bystander effect, and every bystander who witnessed it happening, even though it was staged, for some odd reason believed that it was somebody else that was going to stop it. Somebody needs to do something. And so my issue and my argumentation here in the thing about these kinds of tragedies is that if your immediate response is somebody over there has to do something about it, be warned. Be warned, because that's exactly the sentiment which produces the political hay for people who might actually disdain you. But there's a double meaning going here, and there's a second version of how tragedy has been weaponized or can be weaponized even in our current milieu that I want to put on display, because this one not only has personal impacts for the way that we think about morality and the use of force and even self-defense, but also it serves as a word of warning towards the way ideology wields identity as a sort of casus belli for the use of force against other people. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk about the death of one Nex Benedict, which is a tragedy. It is a tragedy, and I am here talking about a tragedy. I am almost, in a sense, trying to put on display the nuance of this of how we assess tragedy and look for lessons in our own world. Because tragedies, in these sense, are meaningful events. They're not just, they might be negative events, but they're meaningful events. If something is tragic, it has importance. It doesn't, well, it could have importance. So let me be clear, and don't pursue tragedy for the sake of importance. It doesn't have to be pain that makes it real in that sense. But side note. So when the story first broke, and from when it started reaching into the internet, the story was presented something like this. You had a 16-year-old non-binary person who went by the name of Nex Benedict, who was being bullied, ended up in an altercation in a bathroom, and then died later due to her injuries. And that was this was another example of how the system of the United States is so intolerant and so unsupportive of LGBTQ youth, and it was it so readily persecuted the religion that is the LGBTQ. And so you saw this immediately unfold, and it immediately looked like, another perfect case in point version of a tragedy that fit the definition of, or fit the narrative so well, it had to be on blast. And it was, it would be a tragedy. We don't want people to die like this. But then the information kind of started leaking out more and more and more. And so it turns out that there was a police officer that there was an interaction between a police officer and one Nex Benedict and her mother. And so for clarification, for the rest of this video, I'm going to refer to Nex as from her birth name, which was Dagny, and she was it's going to be she, Dagny. Um, but Dagny and her mother were approached by a police officer when she was in the hospital, and the initial parts of the interaction present a little bit of smugness. You have this, sort of. The police officer is asking, is talking to Dagny and her mother, and kind of following up. And there's this kind of this odd air of smugness in the room, until at one point in time, the police officer informs Dagny that she was not the victim, but the aggressor in the situation. And from there, the tonal shift took place. And of course, pundits and internet personalities looked into, tried to find what happened, what actually happened, as if we were all judges and investigators of some sorts. But what ended up happening, at least the story that started rolling out, was not only was it not the case that Dagny was bullied in the bathroom, but that she initiated the confrontation. She initiated the confrontation, and so you could go so far as to say that in all actuality, Dagny was the bully. And I think the importance of this, or the way that that actually plays out well, is that the initial interaction with the police officer identified that Dagny believed that she had the upper hand because she could claim victimhood status by calling herself non-binary. In other words, there was an air of righteousness. There's a presentation of righteousness in her actions that was which was quickly eroded away when she was confronted with what the police officers said, that she was the aggressor, that in the event that took place, her bullying for her identity, she wasn't in the case of the police officer's presentation being bullied for her beliefs, but she was the aggressor. She started the fight. She initiated the conflict. And so, why you might argue that Dagny was actually functioning as the bully in the situation was because she believed that she had the upper hand, not necessarily physically, but ideologically. That she had the institutional support. That if she got into a fight and lost the fight, she could always claim victimhood status. We saw this early on, or we saw this kind of happening in the early 2000s, as you saw that form of kind of feminism rise up, where women can be just like men. In fact, they can do men things better. And so you'd go to a bar and a woman would be, this is kind of like that early, this is not my story, this is somebody else's story, but you'd hear cases of like these women who would try to act like men, and you might get words like butch and whatever, but those are all insulting. And they would try to play on equal grounds with a man, and then until they got punched, and now all of a sudden they were a feminine woman. Like, oh my gosh, there is no differentiation between men and women until it actually matters to me, and then there's a huge differentiation, or the disingenuousness of how women should have equal rights in our society, but not equal responsibilities. And so this seems to be another iteration of that same sort of worldview of rules for thee and not for me, or I have an advantage over you ideologically, or by identity. By identifying as something, I gain a inherent advantage over you because I can now claim victimhood status whenever I start something that I don't want to finish. And so it looks like for Dagny, this is what happened. That she was convinced, she was a child, but she was convinced sort of colloquially and culturally that she could claim victimhood status as a form of defense. And I don't know if this is certain, but it's a common recreation I've seen in the past, where so long as I identify as something, whatever the current thing is, then in the event that I am losing the fight that I start, now I get to claim victimhood status. And then where the tragedy actually takes place, though, is that Dagny then, as far as it's reported, Dagny the following day did suicide, which is again one of those things where it's like it is tragic. And the to contain the tragedy, because I don't have personal connection with the family. I'm not from Oklahoma. I don't know the people. Uh, so I'm not claiming that sort of connection. But now you have a series of events that look very different than how they were initially reported. Initially reporting, you have a person who publicly identifies as non-binary is being bullied for being non-binary, and I think that's an important element. She's not just being bullied, she's being bullied because of her beliefs. And she's being bullied because of her beliefs and then ends up dying because of it. She is a martyr for the LGBTQ cause because she was so bold and brave in living out her identity that it cost her life. But then the information that comes out turns out to be quite different. It turns out to be not only quite different, but almost the opposite. Is that it wouldn't be so? I don't. It's not a stretch to say that there was an there was beef at a school. There was conflict at a school. Our Dagny started a fight, lost the fight, believed that she had a right to claim victimhood status on the basis of her identity. That was called out publicly, and then she was identified as the aggressor. So not only was she not going to get her victimhood status, rather she was going to be understood as the person who created the problem to begin with, and then potentially as a result of that shame, she took her life. And that is the tragedy. We don't want this to happen. That is the tragedy in that instead of saying, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that, instead of apologizing and coming to terms with that sort of ideologically imposed arrogance that she might be carrying, she decided to end her life. And there's another to that, which is it is entirely possible that the death was accidental. It's just been ruled out from the last report that I read. It has just been ruled out that it was not considered, or that the injuries sustained from the alleged bullying had nothing to do with her death. That something else caused it. I think that's the case, at least as far as I know that there's no prosecution. There's no charges being. What's the word? It's the it's not going forward in a court as a state of victimhood. So what does this mean for us? Well, it creates a series of problems, and what it's not like the tragedy aside. If we can sort of pull away from that, not artificially produce in ourselves a sense of urgency or fake concern over the events that happened, because as far as I am concerned, I can only do so much, and I don't want to be disingenuous about that. But what rather is much more important is how this kind of event has been, will be, or has been, is currently, and will be used in that never let a good tragedy go to waste mindset. The second darker side of that intellectual operation. So I don't think it is a stretch. In fact, I don't think it's a stretch because I've seen it on social media. I've already seen it through whether it's Twitter or X or even Wikipedia now, or headlines in articles saying that prosecutors refuse to go forward on her case because of the cause of death. This is not an uncommon thing to happen, where she will be foisted as a martyr. She'll be foisted as a martyr in defense of a faith. And there is this much deeper, darker tone, harkens back to a series of literature that that when strung together, when in the hands of the right person or the wrong person, might motivate people to do more, to execute more events that are tragic. To we've seen that. I'm stumbling over my words because it's so specific. The person who the person who shot up the Christian school in Nashville, killing 6, including 3 children, identified worldview and persecution as justifications for her use of force. The very mindset that we're seeing here play out is it's not as simple and it's not as short-sighted as something like, you know, people in the government. We're dealing with uh, incompatible worldviews that are colliding in our culture. They cannot coexist because one of them cannot abide the existence of something that does not pay fealty to or pay homage to its authority. So the issue here, and I think on a individual, your churches, your communities, your family level concern, is that it is reasonable through past events to look at what may come forward for and identify that through the literature of people like one Malcolm Nance. Um, so this is from page 50. Many he uses this phrase. I think it's his own phrase, but it's called Titus. It's the Trump insurgency of the United States. It's just whatever the right is, I guess. Many Titus extremists favor the elimination, arrest, or execution of political enemies. That's a quote. Another one. The political fringe of the party gives tacit approval and, on occasion, active support to these extremists. For example, on April 2018, one Facebook user wrote about Hillary Clinton and liberals. Now do we get to hang them? Major Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was later elected into Congress from Georgia, replied using phrases from the QAnon cult that threatened a genocide of all liberals. That's a nice play of words there, Malcolm Nance. The stage is being set. Players are being put into place. We must remain patient. This must be done perfectly, or liberal judges would let them off. Titus has openly supported acts of terrorism and lionized the perpetrators. 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot to death 2 liberal protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, became the symbol of armed youth against progressive values. Patches and T-shirts of his image parading an AR-15 rifle are sold around the nation. Terrorist elements of Titus, blah, 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 blah. So the thesis, the argument that Malcolm Nance presents in his book is that that there are extremists in the right wing, and they are aligned with Trump, and that that it is their desire to do violence against minorities and LGBTQ people and so on and so forth. And the strange thing is, yeah, I'm sure you can find them. I'm sure you could find ones or twos. I'm sure you could find people who are in this sense are functioning as intellectual casualties. They've taken on so much political and emotional jargon that they no longer are making rational decisions about the world. They're not even controlling their use of force through a moral system. They've become desperate and angry, which I think might be the point of certain activities, is to institute moral injuries on the population so that they might lash back and then use that reaction as justification for further escalation of force on behalf of the government. And I know that's a complicated way of saying it, but it's another way of saying it's a trap. We talked with James Lindsay recently, and he said multiple times that the reaction is the objective. I think that's the language he uses. But the action desired is the reaction of the opponent. And what you might see here is that there might be nefarious escalation of rhetoric for the purpose of motivating less discerning individuals to engage in force too publicly, thus giving a institution, a government, an organization justification through a tragic event to do something evil. And the problem here then is that it doesn't play both ways. It really never gets to play both ways. And this is where you see the evil of it. You get to see the evil of it is that the language and the rhetoric used in the case of what happened with Dagny Benedict here will be it will be translated through Malcolm Nance into Mark Bray, which is the Antifa handbook that talks about preemptive self-defense, and thus justifying somebody, creating the justification for somebody to use force preemptively. In other words, the death of Dagny is evidence that there is a threat, and that because there is a threat, and that threat is now magnified by Malcolm Nance in how horrible his rhetoric is, and how his solution is more force and an escalation of force against the American citizens, then that can be translated through the writings of like Antifa and Mark Bray to to justify in the person preemptive self-defense, which will take place that which can manifest in two different forms. One of them is the Black Bloc riot, where buildings are burned, businesses are destroyed, things are looted, cars are set on fire. You have domestic unrest, which is kind of wielded for insanity. And eventually I have to talk about what it was like being on the ground in Minneapolis in 2020 and 2021. But the other thing about it, and I think the other part that's much more personally dangerous, is that it is the exact pathway of radicalization. Now, I've talked about this book in the past, Why Young Men by Jamil Javani, and he outlines how radical extremists, or people that were referred to as radical extremists to some extent, is like you have in the Nation of Islam, would identify disenfranchised young men and give them a purpose to live for, and that purpose included fighting against their oppressors. And instead of building into their community, participating in their world, and so on and so forth. So instead of doing what is good for your world, you must do what is evil, because you are justified in doing evil because you are the holy victim. And that mentality is being recreated here in the death of Dagny, and it is being recreated here in the words of Malcolm Nance, and it's being recreated over there with the writing of Mark Bray in the Antifa Handbook, and that is the victimhood status is, so long as one claims victimhood status, they are justified in violence. And then you have the problems. Then you have the issues with, like the Nashville shooter, whose manifesto very clearly outlined her motivations, and then you have other examples of this extremism, because instead of understanding that Dagny may have very well, instead of understanding that Dagny committed suicide, possibly out of shame, possibly out of accident, and we hope, possibly out of shame, possibly out of accident, instead of understanding what took place, there's the narrative is already set. The narrative is already set that the death of Dagny is considered justification, or it is evidence enough to support that there is a political persecution against my people, my religion, my faith, which is incompatible with Christianity, as both make fundamental claims about reality and identity. Christianity claims that your identity, the essence of your identity, is created in the image of God, whereas the LGBTQ religion implies that your identity is self-generating, you are self-sufficient, and these two things are incompatible with one another. They cannot fit together because they both are trying to sit in the seat of authority. And so then because I cannot abide the existence in the language that's being said of an opposition, I am justified in using violence. And so that, in conclusion, is the weaponization of tragedy, not simply to make political hay, but how ideologies can turn tragedies into a casus belli for violence. If this has helped, you can support us at redactedllc.com. Other than that, we'll talk to you later. Go forth and conquer.